The hidden rules of social hierarchies. A woman walks into a coffee shop and sees two people she knows sitting at separate tables. One is her boss. The other is a friend from college. She waves at both. Then she walks toward her friend's table. They talk for a few minutes. She laughs. She sits down. She pulls out her phone and shows her friend a photo. Her boss glances over twice during this time. The woman sees this but doesn't walk over. She doesn't wave again. She stays where she is. 10 minutes later, her boss stands up to leave. As he passes, the woman sits up straighter. She smiles differently than she smiled at her friend. She says, "Oh, hey, I didn't see you come in." Her boss nods and says, "No problem. See you Monday." After he leaves, her friend says, "You totally saw him." The woman says, "I know." Her friend asks why she didn't just go say hi when she first walked in. The woman pauses. Then she says, "I don't know. It just felt weird." But she does know. She didn't want to interrupt him. She didn't want him to think she was trying too hard. She didn't want to seem like she was bothering him in his personal time. She didn't want to make it awkward. None of these thoughts were loud or clear. They were quiet and automatic. They shaped her behavior without her deciding anything. Her friend didn't have those thoughts. Her friend saw someone she knew and expected the woman to act the same way with both people. But the woman didn't. She treated one person like an equal and the other person like someone above her. This difference wasn't about personality. It was about position. And the position didn't stop mattering just because they weren't at work. What social hierarchy is. Social hierarchy is the invisible ranking system that exists between people. It determines who defers to whom, who interrupts whom, who apologizes more, who waits longer, and who gets to decide what happens next. It's not the same as a formal org chart. A hierarchy can exist between two people who have never worked together. It can exist between friends. It can exist in a family. It can exist in a group text. Hierarchy forms whenever there is an imbalance in leverage. Leverage means the ability to affect someone else's outcomes without them being able to affect yours in the same way. If you need something from someone more than they need something from you, they have leverage. If they can ignore you without consequence, but you can't ignore them, they have leverage. If they control access to something you want, they have leverage. Once leverage exists, behavior changes. The person with less leverage adjusts how they speak, when they speak, and what they ask for. The person with more leverage doesn't have to adjust as much. Over time, this difference becomes normal. It stops feeling like a choice. It starts feeling like the natural way to interact. Most people don't think about hierarchy until it breaks. They notice it when someone violates the unspoken rules. They notice it when someone acts too familiar with the person above them, or when someone with power suddenly loses it and no one knows how to treat them anymore. But the hierarchy is always there. It shapes every interaction. It just does so quietly. How hierarchy forms in everyday situations. Hierarchy doesn't require anyone to announce it. It forms through small, repeated signals about who needs whom and what the cost of conflict would be. A manager hires someone. On the first day, the new employee sends an email asking what time the team meeting is. The manager responds 3 hours later with just the time. No greeting, no explanation. The employee waits for the response. They don't follow up. They don't assume the manager forgot. They check their email multiple times. When the response finally comes, they feel relieved. The manager doesn't check email obsessively. They respond when it's convenient. They don't worry that the employee will be annoyed by the delay. They don't feel the need to explain why it took 3 hours. This small interaction establishes something. It establishes that the employee's time is more flexible than the manager's. It establishes that waiting is the employee's job, not the manager's. It establishes that the manager controls the flow of information. Neither person decided this explicitly. It happened because their positions created different costs for waiting and different consequences for being wrong. The same pattern shows up outside of work. A group of friends makes plans. One person always suggests the time and place. Another person always says, "That works for me," even when it doesn't really work. Over months, the second person starts to expect that plans will be made around the first person's schedule. They stop suggesting alternatives. They adjust. Why? Because the first person has other options. They have other friends. They're busy. If the second person pushes back too much, the first person might stop inviting them. The second person knows this without anyone saying it. The hierarchy isn't about one person being better. It's about one person having more flexibility and less need. That difference creates leverage. And leverage creates hierarchy. A parent tells a teenager to clean their room. The teenager says, "I will." The parent leaves. An hour later, the room is still messy. The parent comes back and says, "I told you to clean your room." The teenager says, "I'm about to." The parent doesn't need to yell or threaten. The teenager knows that if they don't comply, something will happen. Maybe they lose phone privileges. Maybe the parent gets angry and the house feels tense. Maybe the parent brings it up later in front of someone else. The teenager doesn't have leverage. They can delay, but they can't refuse. The parent has control over resources, freedom, and emotional climate. So the teenager complies, even if they don't want to, even if they complain while doing it. The hierarchy is obvious here, but the same structure exists in less obvious places. A person texts a friend. The friend doesn't respond for 2 days. When they finally respond, they don't apologize. They just pick up the conversation as if no time passed. The person who sent the first text doesn't say, "Why didn't you respond?" They just respond back quickly, matching the friend's tone. Why don't they ask? Because they don't want to seem needy. Because they assume the friend was busy. Because they don't want to risk making the friend feel guilty or annoyed. Because they want the friend to keep texting them. The friend doesn't have to manage any of this. They can respond when they want. They don't have to explain. The imbalance is small but real. And over time, it trains both people how to act. How hierarchy changes communication. Once hierarchy exists, people communicate differently depending on which side they're on. The person lower in the hierarchy uses more words. They explain their requests. They soften their language. They add phrases like, "if you get a chance," or "no rush," or "just wondering." They apologize for things that aren't problems. They thank people for things that are expected. A person emails their boss. "Hi, I hope you're having a good week. I wanted to follow up on the report I sent last Thursday. I know you're really busy, so no rush at all, but I just wanted to make sure it didn't get lost. Let me know if you need anything else from me. Thanks so much." The boss emails back, "Got it, looks fine." The difference isn't about personality, it's about position. The person lower in the hierarchy is managing risk. They're managing the possibility that their email might be seen as pushy or annoying. They're managing the fact that they need a response more than the other person needs to give one. So they add cushioning. They make their requests smaller. They take up less space. The person higher in the hierarchy doesn't have to do this. Their responses can be short. They don't have to apologize for delays. They don't have to explain why they didn't respond sooner. They can say, "Got it," and that's enough. This creates a feedback loop. The person lower in the hierarchy starts to believe that long, apologetic emails are polite. They start to think that short responses are rude. But when they try to write shorter emails, they feel uncomfortable. It feels too direct. It feels risky. Meanwhile, the person higher in the hierarchy doesn't feel rude when they respond with 2 words. They feel efficient. They assume the other person understands they're busy. They don't think about how much time the other person spent crafting a careful message. The same dynamic shows up in meetings. A junior employee has an idea. They wait for a pause. They say, "I was just thinking, and this might be totally off. But what if we tried?" Someone interrupts them. Not aggressively, just to add a thought. The junior employee stops talking. They don't try to finish their sentence. They nod and let the other person speak. A senior employee has the same idea. They don't wait for a pause, they just start talking. If someone tries to interrupt, they keep going. They say, "Hold on, let me finish." People wait. When they're done, someone says, "That's a good point." The idea is the same, the reception is different. Not because one person explained it better. Because one person had the leverage to command attention, and the other didn't. People lower in the hierarchy also track timing more carefully. They notice how long it takes someone to respond. They notice when someone reads a message but doesn't reply. They interpret delays as signals. A person texts their boss on a Saturday afternoon with a quick question. The boss doesn't respond. The person checks their phone multiple times. They wonder if the question was inappropriate. They wonder if they should have waited until Monday. They start drafting an apology text. Then they delete it. Then they wait. The boss sees the text. They think, "I'll answer that later." Then they forget. On Monday, they see the text again and respond. They don't think about the fact that the person spent the weekend wondering if they did something wrong. This isn't cruelty. It's just different costs. The person with leverage doesn't have to track timing the same way. They don't have to worry as much about how their silence will be interpreted. The person without leverage does. Silence works differently depending on who's using it. When someone higher in the hierarchy goes quiet, people below them fill the silence. They check in. They ask if everything is okay. They send follow-up messages. They assume they did something wrong. When someone lower in the hierarchy goes quiet, people above them often don't notice. Or if they do notice, they assume the person is busy or doesn't need anything. They don't follow up. They wait for the other person to reach out. This creates another loop. The person lower in the hierarchy learns that silence from above is a signal. Maybe it means disapproval. Maybe it means disinterest. So they respond to silence by trying harder. The person higher in the hierarchy learns that silence from below is normal. It doesn't mean anything urgent. They can respond when it's convenient. Both people think their behavior is reasonable. Neither realizes they're operating in different systems. How people can misread hierarchy as personality. People often explain hierarchical behavior as if it's about who someone is instead of where someone is. A manager notices that one of their employees always sends long, apologetic emails. The manager thinks, this person is insecure. They need to be more confident. The employee notices that their manager sends short, direct emails. The employee thinks, this person is so confident. I wish I could be like that. Neither is seeing the structure, they're both seeing personality. But the behavior they're noticing is largely about position. If the employee got promoted and suddenly had 5 people reporting to them, their emails would change. They would stop adding as many softening phrases. They would stop apologizing for following up. Not because they became more confident overnight. Because the cost of being direct would drop and the cost of over-explaining would rise. If the manager lost their job and had to start job hunting, their emails to recruiters would look different. They would be longer. They would include more thanking and softening. Not because they became insecure, because they would suddenly be in a position with less leverage. People resist this idea. They want to believe that their communication style is about who they are. They want to believe that confident people act confident and insecure people act insecure, regardless of context. But behavior is more flexible than identity. People adjust constantly based on what the situation rewards and punishes. They just don't notice themselves doing it. A person is loud and opinionated with their family. They interrupt. They argue. They take up space. At work, the same person is quiet. They wait to be asked for input. They agree with their boss, even when they disagree privately. They don't interrupt. If you ask their family, they would describe this person as assertive and stubborn. If you ask their coworkers, they would describe the same person as agreeable and reserved. Both descriptions feel true to the people giving them. But neither description is about the person's core personality. Both are about how the person acts in a particular structure. This matters because people make decisions based on these misreadings. A manager thinks an employee is too passive, so they don't promote the employee. They think this person doesn't have leadership presence. What they don't see is that the employee acts passive because the structure taught them that assertiveness is risky. The employee learned to wait, to soften, to defer. They learned this because those behaviors were rewarded in their current position. But now those same behaviors are being used as evidence that they're not ready for a higher position. The same thing happens in relationships. A person is dating someone who rarely initiates plans. The person thinks, they're just not that into me. So they pull back. They stop reaching out as much. The distance grows. Eventually, the relationship ends. What they didn't see was that the other person learned early on that their suggestions often got dismissed or changed. So they stopped suggesting things. They started waiting to be told what the plan was. This wasn't about lack of interest. It was about learned behavior in a small hierarchy where one person's preferences mattered more. When people misread hierarchy as personality, they miss the leverage. They think the solution is for the other person to change who they are. But the actual solution is often to change the structure or to recognize that the behavior will shift if the position shifts. How hierarchy sustains itself. Hierarchy doesn't require constant enforcement. Once it's established, it runs on autopilot. Both people maintain it through small everyday choices. The person lower in the hierarchy maintains it by adjusting their behavior to avoid conflict or loss. They wait longer. They ask more carefully. They don't push back on small things. Each time they adjust, they reinforce the idea that adjustment is their job. The person higher in the hierarchy maintains it by not adjusting. They respond when convenient. They don't track timing as closely. They don't soften their language. Each time they don't adjust, they reinforce the idea that adjustment isn't their job. Neither person is trying to create a hierarchy. They're just responding to incentives. But their responses lock the pattern in place. A professor sends a student an email asking them to stop by during office hours. The student replies within an hour. "Absolutely, I'll be there. What time works best for you?" The professor replies 2 days later with a time. The student doesn't say, "Why did it take you 2 days to respond?" They just show up at the time the professor suggested, even if that time is inconvenient for them. The professor doesn't think about the 2-day delay. They replied when they had time. They don't assume the student was waiting anxiously. They don't feel guilty. This interaction teaches both people something. It teaches the student that their time is flexible and the professor's time is fixed. It teaches the professor that they don't have to prioritize student emails the same way students have to prioritize their emails. The next time the student emails, they'll wait even longer before following up. They'll add even more cushioning language. The professor will continue to reply when convenient. The gap will widen. The same thing happens in workplaces. An employee suggests an idea in a meeting. The manager says, "Interesting, let me think about that." The employee waits. A week goes by. The employee doesn't bring it up again. They assume if the manager wanted to pursue it, the manager would say something. The manager forgets about the idea. They had 10 other things to think about. When they see the employee later, they don't remember the suggestion. The employee interprets this as rejection. They stop suggesting ideas. The manager doesn't notice that the employee stops suggesting ideas. Or if they do notice, they think, "This person just isn't very proactive." The loop closes. The employee becomes less visible. The manager invests less in them. The hierarchy deepens. Hierarchy also sustains itself through observation. People watch how others are treated and adjust their behavior accordingly. A new employee joins a team. They notice that when one coworker emails the boss responds within an hour. When another coworker emails the boss responds a day later. The new employee doesn't know why this difference exists, but they notice it. And they start to form a theory about which coworkers matter more. They also start to adjust their own behavior. They try to figure out what the high-response coworker is doing differently. Maybe that coworker keeps emails shorter. Maybe they only email about urgent things. Maybe they've been there longer. The new employee starts experimenting. They try different approaches. They watch what gets fast responses and what gets slow ones. No one explained the hierarchy to them. They learned it by watching. This is how hierarchies replicate across groups. People don't need to be told the rules. They see the patterns and adjust. And their adjustment reinforces the pattern for the next person. When hierarchy breaks, hierarchy becomes visible when it suddenly doesn't work the way it used to. A manager gets laid off. On their last day, people who used to respond to their emails within minutes stop responding at all. Messages go unanswered. People who used to laugh at their jokes don't laugh anymore. The manager realizes that what felt like respect was actually deference, and deference only lasts as long as the position does. This is disorienting. The manager thought certain relationships were personal. They thought people liked them. Some people probably did. But the behavior they were interpreting as liking was often just a response to leverage. Once the leverage disappeared, the behavior changed. The same thing happens in less dramatic ways. A person's roommate moves out. Suddenly, the person realizes they were always the one adjusting. They were the one who stayed quiet when they wanted to talk. They were the one who cleaned up messes that weren't theirs. They were the one who said yes to plans they didn't want. They didn't notice this while it was happening. But as soon as the roommate is gone, they feel lighter. They feel like they have more space. They might describe this as "my roommate was controlling." But often it's not that simple. The roommate wasn't controlling. The roommate just had more leverage. Maybe they were on the lease first. Maybe they knew the landlord. Maybe they had more money. Maybe they just acted like their preferences mattered more. And the other person believed them. Once the structure ends, the behavior that seemed like personality disappears. The person who is always adjusting stops adjusting. They start making their own plans. They start saying no. They realize they were never actually passive. They were just responding to a structure that made passivity the safer choice. Hierarchy also breaks when someone refuses to follow the unspoken rules. A junior employee stops sending long, apologetic emails. They start writing like their manager writes. Short, direct, no cushioning. Their manager notices. The manager might not say anything directly, but they might start treating the employee differently. They might see the employee as difficult or overconfident. They might stop giving them certain opportunities. Or the opposite might happen. The manager might start taking the employee more seriously. They might see the directness as leadership potential. The shift in communication might signal that the employee is ready to move up. The outcome depends on timing and context. But either way, the change in communication forces the hierarchy to renegotiate itself. It reveals that the hierarchy wasn't natural or fixed. It was maintained by both people's behavior. And when one person's behavior changes, the other person has to respond. The same thing happens when someone higher in the hierarchy suddenly starts acting like they're lower. A boss starts apologizing constantly. They start asking permission for things they used to just decide. They start sending long, over-explained emails. Their team doesn't know what to do with this. It feels wrong. Some people might appreciate it. They might think the boss is being humble or collaborative. Other people might lose respect. They might think the boss is weak or uncertain. The boss isn't necessarily doing anything wrong, but they're violating the expectations that come with their position. And when expectations get violated, people don't know how to act. Hierarchy is invisible when it's working. It becomes visible when it stops working. And when it becomes visible, people realize how much of their behavior was shaped by it. What happens in low-stakes hierarchies? Not all hierarchies are about jobs or authority. Some are much smaller, but they still shape behavior. Two friends make plans. One friend is always a little bit late. The other friend is always on time. After a while, the on-time friend starts arriving 5 minutes late. Not because they changed as a person, because they learned that being on time means waiting. And waiting feels bad. The late friend doesn't notice this shift. They're still arriving at the same time they always did. But the dynamic has changed. The on-time friend has stopped adjusting as much. They've reclaimed a small amount of control. If the late friend suddenly started arriving on time, the on-time friend might feel surprised. They might even feel slightly uncomfortable, because the pattern had become normal. And when patterns change, even for the better, people feel the shift. Small hierarchies like this exist everywhere. In a group chat, one person always sends messages late at night. Everyone else responds quickly. Eventually, people stop responding as quickly. They've learned that this person will keep texting regardless, so they stop prioritizing the messages. The person texting doesn't notice that responses are slower. Or if they do, they don't connect it to their own behavior. They just think people are busy. But the group has quietly adjusted. They've created a small boundary, not through confrontation, through behavior. This is how hierarchies shift in low-stakes situations, not through conversation, through quiet adjustments that compound over time. A parent always chooses the restaurant when the family goes out to eat. No one objects, but over time, the kids stop suggesting places. They learn that their suggestions don't matter, so they stop making them. The parent doesn't realize this is happening. They think the kids just don't care where they eat, and maybe after enough time, the kids don't care anymore. They've learned that caring doesn't change anything, so they stop caring. This is how hierarchies become internalized. The person with less leverage stops wanting things they know they can't have. They adjust their preferences to match what's available. And then it looks like there was never a conflict in the first place. What this means for everyday interactions. Most people move through multiple hierarchies every day. At work, they're below their boss and above their reports. At home, they're above their kids and maybe below their partner in certain areas. With friends, the hierarchy shifts depending on the context. These shifts require constant adjustment. People learn to read the room. They learn when to speak up and when to stay quiet. They learn who to defer to and who to push back on. They do this without thinking about it. But the adjustment has a cost. People who spend most of their time in low-leverage positions develop habits that are hard to turn off. They apologize reflexively. They explain themselves even when no explanation is needed. They assume they're bothering people. They wait for permission. People who spend most of their time in high-leverage positions develop different habits. They assume their preferences matter. They expect quick responses. They don't track timing the same way. They take up space without questioning whether they should. Neither set of habits is inherently good or bad, but they create friction when people from different positions interact. A person who has spent years in corporate environments where they had low leverage goes on a date. They over-explain. They apologize for small things. They defer constantly. The other person finds this off-putting. They think the person is insecure. But the person isn't insecure. They're just carrying habits from a structure where deference was required. Those habits don't turn off easily. They bleed into other contexts. The same thing happens in reverse. A person who has high leverage at work comes home and treats their partner the way they treat their reports. They're brief. They make decisions without consulting. They don't explain. The partner feels dismissed. The person doesn't realize they're doing this. At work, this behavior is normal. It's efficient. No one questions it. But at home, it creates distance. Recognizing hierarchy doesn't fix these problems, but it changes how people interpret them. Instead of thinking, my partner is controlling, a person might think, we've fallen into a pattern where my partner makes most of the decisions and I've stopped pushing back. That's a different problem. It has different solutions. Instead of thinking, this person is so insecure, someone might think, this person is acting like they have less leverage than they do. That opens up space to shift the dynamic instead of just judging the behavior. Hierarchy is everywhere. It's not always a problem, but it's always shaping how people act. And most of the time, people don't see it. They see personality, they see confidence or insecurity, they see rudeness or politeness. What they don't see is the invisible ranking system that makes certain behaviors feel natural for some people and risky for others. Once you start looking for it, you see it constantly. You see it in who apologizes first after an argument. You see it in who waits longer for a text back. You see it in who suggests plans and who just agrees. You see it in who interrupts and who lets themselves be interrupted. You see it in who has to explain themselves and who doesn't. You see it in who gets the benefit of the doubt and who has to prove they deserve it. None of this is fixed. Hierarchies shift. Leverage changes. People move up and down constantly. But while a hierarchy exists, it shapes everything. And the quieter it is, the more powerful it becomes. Because when people can't see the structure, they blame the person. They think someone is just difficult, or just passive, or just inconsiderate. They don't see that the behavior makes sense given the position. The woman in the coffee shop didn't avoid her boss because she's socially awkward. She avoided him because approaching him felt risky in a way that approaching her friend didn't. The hierarchy was still active even on a Saturday morning, even in a casual setting. She knew this, but she couldn't quite explain it. So she said, it just felt weird. That's how hierarchy works most of the time. It doesn't announce itself. It just makes certain behaviors feel natural and others feel weird. And people follow that feeling without questioning where it came from.